Well, hello, folks. I'm L.A. Little, and this is your daily TA wrap. We take a look at these markets, and we do it from a neoclassical perspective, each time asking ourselves what happened today and what does it tell us about the coming ones. I do this show 4 times a week, every Monday through Thursday, live at 9 o'clock Eastern Time here, and archived on YouTube under the channel L.A. Little, so you can check it out there if you can't make the show live. Of course, if you make the show live, you have the opportunity to ask questions. Oh, what a benefit that is, huh? You can type those questions into the chat room here on live stream, or of course you can pop me a question or two. Just tell me what your time frame is, what you're trying to do, so that I have some context to work with. And you can do that at this number, the 303-912-9110. You can email me at support. That's the text line. You can email me at support. I'll take it from either direction. As far as what happened today, well, today these markets did the bounce. We got a bounce going on Friday, if you remember. And today there was a continuation of that bounce as the composite, the NDX, both of those up the most. Actually, the Russell was the strongest. And if you remember now, the Russell has been the strongest for about, I guess it's about 7 days running, trading days running now. So up almost 1%. But then if you look down, the listed issues really struggled, right? You had the Dow just barely break even. You had the S&Ps up 0.25%. 0.5% on the NDX, 0.75% on the broader composite. So it's almost like there's a rotation that's been going on here to the smaller caps, broader composite. I suspect what's happening there is what I was telling members this weekend, and that is that we're getting a lot more trend changes on the intermediate term time frame, and typically when that happens, you tend to get some sort of a bounce, and I think you're getting a bounce in all those issues that are getting beaten down or have been beaten down. Elsewhere, gold pretty flat, really not much going on elsewhere. It was really in the indexes today, and that's probably where we want to turn our attention to. So let me pop over, grab the charts of the indexes themselves, and we'll take a look at them. All right, here we go. So S&P 500, let's start with that one. Now coming into today, we had 2 things going on. We had a retest regenerate on Friday of the lowest of the swing point lows that have been broken. Remember, we've broken 5 along the way down here. So 5 of them on the way down. We break higher on Friday into the bottom of that breakdown bar, which got us back into the second level of the retest regenerate. That level happens to be where we bounced on the first bounce. We pushed up into that level, failed to get over it, which was a regenerate, which sent us lower. Now we come back up, the odds a little bit better on the second push, yet we go to that exact same area. What do? We get over it, we close underneath it, we have less volume. This thing once more looks like it wants to try to regenerate lower. And so you have to expect that this thing's going to try to push back down now. And then the question is, of course, where might it come back to? Well, the first area that you have to look at, which is where the TA Today charts are showing you, the green bar, that small green bar, that is a support zone off of this and this. So that little area right there, that congruent area, that area is where this thing's going to come back to initially. Price points on that, 1928.89, and this is the S&P. 1930 is the other side of it. So it's from about 1929 roughly to 1930. We close at 1937 roughly, so 7 points down. That's going to be the spot that it tries to come to. Now, if it gets back underneath it, the next logical place is back down here. That's off the second of the 2 large bars down. Bottom of that guy's 1916. So that'd be another 14 points more. That's 21 down. That would be the next logical point. Now, I am sure that there are many looking at this from a technical perspective, a classical TA perspective, and they're seeing visions of, you know, changes here that are going to let this thing bounce again. We've seen it so many times. I'm sure they're thinking that way. At this point, it still is an ABCD structure to the downside. It just redrew itself. And what I'm talking about is we had this structure here, right, that was trying to push down. Now we get up higher. So now the structure just goes, in my mind, just goes a little bit higher. And we're actually, let's draw this again. So we have just a little bit higher and then back down again. So still targeting back into these lows if in fact it breaks to the lower area. For me, for right now, this thing looks like it wants to try to push lower. And if we look at the weakest index at this particular point, which is the Dow itself, the Dow, if you remember, the Dow was trying to break the swing point lows both on a short-term and intermediate-term time frame. That was these lows down here. It tested into them, bounced off of them, and what did it do? It went into the retest regenerate off of that swing point low. That's a bearish retest regenerate. After 6 bars, remember 6 bars is always our measure when we're thinking about time with respect to, you know, coming back up and testing. That usually, when that happens, that usually sends you into the bottom of it. You don't get to the top of it, and it tries to regenerate lower, and that's exactly what this is doing. If you draw that one out, right, that's a huge one on the retest regenerate and could get this thing quite a bit lower. So the Dow is the one I would be watching at this point to see how it pushes back down. It's the weakest one out there. It gave the most clear signal tonight of trying to regenerate back to the downside. So that's the one I'll be keeping an eye on come tomorrow. Elsewhere, the Russell, as we said, has been outperforming. The Russell gets up into a higher zone. And one of the things I haven't been showing here, but you do have zones. You kind of have this, you know, 2-zone area here off the Russell. It got almost to that top. That's where we were thinking. We were thinking off of this bar. That's your June 5th bar. The top of it was about 1154. We got to as high as about 1150. We got to 49. So we get almost up into that area. And as you can see, it left a pretty good tail tonight. Not terrible, but a pretty good tail on it. And what that tells you, you know, you gap up, you run higher, and then the sellers kind of take control. On the Russell, what I'm going to be watching for is how does it test back into this area first. And if it gets back into that, then you have to expect the Russell to try to get back into this zone. Russell at this point has gotten over this swing point low and is trying to get back into the prior one, which is where that resistance zone is off that big bar over here. So Russell, there's nothing here tonight to give us any kind of an indication that we're going to fail. The only slight indication is the fact that the sellers took control by the end of the day. Now, one thing I would note in the case of the S&P 500, in the case of the Russell, those indexes had broken lower, and in the case of the Russell, it was this bar, which was a retest regenerate zone, got over it, just like we said on the S&P, it got over it too. What does that do? That typically throws you into some sort of a range trade for a while. In other words, you've kind of found the bottom near term, and on this time frame, you start moving into a range trade. And so when we think about a range trade, if we go back up and set up those two, you know, areas that we were just talking about, you know, up in this area, that range trade, if it turns out to be that says, or it suggests that what this thing's going to try to do is it's going to try to stay in these two ranges, right, and trade in between them. And so from that perspective, I would be thinking this becomes a very critical area, because the question will be is, what does the range look like? Are we going to trade in this range, or are we going to trade in this whole range, right? And that's a very different market depending on which it does. The same thing we could draw in on the S&P. It's the same scenario. What's that range going to look at or look like over the next few days? It looks to me like it's going to try to trade in this lower range to start with, and then we'll see if it actually can try to break up into the higher range or not, or does it really regenerate lower. And so for now, you're up towards the middle, well, actually up towards the middle of the two ranges, up toward the high of the low range. That's probably not where you want to be buying. And the reason I spend so much time on these is because for tonight, you really don't have that much of an indication anywhere except for in the indexes themselves. And what they're telling you is tomorrow they're going to try to push lower off those two signals. The others are fairly neutral, and that we probably in some sort of a range trade, which means that we're not going to just plummet back down. If I look at the other two indexes, we can look at the IXIC, the NASDAQ Composite. Retest regenerate zone here is 44.25. It got up to 44.15, so it pushes up towards the highs, and so it's in that range, right? Let me just draw it in here. It's in this retest regenerate zone. It got almost, and it looks like I gave you the wrong number, 44.15. It got up to 44.15, so it just missed it by a couple pennies. So it got almost to the top. That's a full retest, and it's going to try to regenerate lower. Now, whether it does or not, we'll have to see, but that's what it's going to try to do. And again, this looks like it's more of a range trade, although this one hasn't gotten over it to suggest that. But the fact that these ABCD structures, like this one, for example, did not fulfill, and you come back up and you get over the highs, suggest also some sort of a range trade. And if we look at the NDX, which is a little bit stronger, NDX is just coming back up towards its retest regenerate zone. And that retest regenerate zone is off of this swing point low, and it didn't quite get there so far. Volumes today low, and I guess, you know, it's summer, so that's probably expected. So taking that and trying to wrap it all together, because there's really not much of an indication elsewhere, and we'll flip through the sectors next, but in summary, it appears to me that you're going to get some sort of an attempt to pull this thing back tomorrow. And it may not be that deep, but some sort of a pullback is setting up for tomorrow's trade. In the longer perspective, and I want to kind of segue here into the second half of the show now after I've done kind of the summary. I'm going to go back to the S&P 500. In the longer term perspective, you have ranges, once range trade sets up, then you have the large ranges that you want to focus on. So if we take the whole range, right, we're talking about a fairly large structure, and we'll just take the extremes here. You got 1904, roughly 1905, up to 1991. That's an 86-point structure. That's pretty big. And within it, as we've already seen on the Russell, and we can see here, inside this thing, you really kind of have two areas that are set up together. One is this high, this part of it up here. The other is the lows down here. And they're about equidistant in between them. Those two ranges become the critical focus as to what's going to happen, because both of them are playable. And what I mean by that is they're large enough. If you take the 86 number, divide it in half, they're roughly 43 points. Well, 43 points is a fairly large range. It's certainly large enough to be traded. And so as one gets towards the highs, that's going to be the opportunity to potentially short. Or if it actually breaks over it, then you've got to expect it's going to try to get to the other side of it. Consequently, you want to get long if it breaks over it. So if I'm a trader, and this is what happens in the market, if I'm a trader and I see this coming up towards this area, I see this bar is testing, I know that it's testing into the swing point high here, I know that that's probably a good place for me to put my shorts on, because I don't have to risk too much, and I can flip around if I have to and go the other way. And so when you're thinking about it from a trader's perspective, traders are going to jump all over this kind of situation to try to make some money, right? That's what they do. They're looking at short-term, swings to try to make money on. So the bulls gap up, run up, they get up to this area, and then what do? They start to give it up. You got a swing point. Now, this isn't a swing point high in my system, in the neoclassical system, but I'm sure everybody else looks at that as a swing point. Gets up there, it tests into it, tests into this area, which to me is the more important one. And what is it doing? It's going to try to regenerate lower. That's what it should do. That's where the sellers should show up. That's what this chart is telling you, right? The neoclassical chart has drawn in where that resistance is. That is where the sellers should show. If they do, then it's going to go back down, right? Consequently, on the way back, like I was talking about, you can see the green area here. That's where the buyers should show up. And you can see it's a very narrow, small area. So again, if I'm a trader, that would be where I'd want to cover my shorts if I put them out up here and buy them back and try to get the bounce back up, thinking in terms of a potential ABCD structure up. That would take us back up to this area. So you can see on a very short-term basis how this thing can trade out. And so as a trader, that's what you're trying to do. As a reader of the charts, you have to see these things coming and recognize that that's the potential, and then you see if it actually does what it should do. And in this case, it did. Remember last week, it didn't. We had these two cases where we traded under lows. It was another setup. We traded under this low. That should give us a bounce. It tried but failed. Does it again, tries, fails terribly, and actually closes at a lower low. At that point, you have to question things. Of course, we finally got the bounce, right? But now we're back into a different trade, and that trade is more than likely going to send us lower. Let's pop over and actually let me see if there's any questions before I do anything. And none there, so let me see if anybody on the board's here. Not yet. Okay, so let me pop in. I want to go to the sectors. Not much of a read in gold, silver. They're just inside days. Gold still looks like, as I talked about last night, is setting up to try to go higher. If I look at the sectors, though, here we go. Most of these are setting up to try to come back down too. So let's just pop through them and look at them real quick. Here's the transports. Looks very much like what we just saw. It's not as clean. You got a lot of swing points down here. The top of this swing point that was was not broken. The one that was broken was here. So let me pop up the. Here we go. Not that one. Here. That was the retest regenerate zone. And folks, I know it's sometimes voodoo type stuff that people talk about when they talk about TA. But I mean, just look at how many times these things do what they're supposed to do. I mean, they're the natural places that you would expect the sellers to potentially come back in. One of the things we're working on the charts is to allow you to, pop these bars up for you to show you the retest regenerate zones because they have significance. And as you can see here, they have a lot more significance when they line up together. I mean, here's two of them together, and look what it did. It went right into both of them. That's going to be tough to get over. And that's, of course, what happened here. If we go into, so that's the IYT. IYT is going to try to trade back down tomorrow. If we look at the SOX is set up the same way. Now, the SOX is a little bit different because the SOX came back into the heavy bars. So if we look at this bar here, and we look at this bar, and we look at the congruence between those two, you can see that anchor zone in red there. And what does it do? It goes right into that resistance zone off these two heavy volume, wide price spread bars, right? That's a wide price spread bar. This one's not as wide, but heavy volume. Goes into it, has some decent volume, but it's not enough compared to what it's coming into. There's a lot more sellers here than there are buyers. Gets into it, reverses, comes down. This one's going to try to trade lower tomorrow as well. XLE, same story. XLE, a little bit different, but the same story. What is it doing? Well, it's broken this swing point low. It tested into it immediately, right? And we know this sector is weak because we actually looked at Exxon, Chevron, and those together. Exxon, we know, is sucking air and is probably going lower. Biggest weighting in this, those three are like 40% of it. Gets up into it, fails, comes back, comes into it, it's going to try it again. It is a range trade at this point because it actually did break another swing point low here. So it got back over it, right? So it's a range trade, but it's going to try to trade back into the lower end of the range. And this probably is the best setup, not best setup, but the best, what I want to call it, tell for what this market's doing, or these setups. And that is that you get over the lowest of the ranges. You've already had a big push down, right? Now you get a bounce that takes you over and you fail to regenerate off the lowest one. S&Ps did that, this one did that, there's a couple others. That suggests, okay, we're going to stay in some sort of range. The Russell also did it. That gives you a good indication, if you are shorting up here, that you do want to cover back down here. You don't want to go for the big bang now because it's probably not going to break down in a large way yet. It's going to build out something here, right? And we're going to find out over the next week or so, is that range all the way to the top, or is it just down here on the bottom, right? And you're trading this range versus the whole range or the top. As long as it stays in this lower range over the next, say, 5, 6, 7 sessions, then you can start thinking about something breaking to the downside. Okay? All right, I think that gives you a good feel for where we're at and what's happening. I'm actually going to cut it short tonight. I've got a conference call coming up. So I'm probably going to try to prepare for that if you don't mind. And since I don't have any questions, I'll leave it a little bit short tonight. Tomorrow, I expect these markets to try to trade down. I expect them to come back into this lower end. I've shown you on the S&P and the Russell where they're going to try to come to. Those are the areas that you have to see. That higher one, see if it tests in there and if it can break it or not. If it does, you're going to get it down almost to the bottom of this range. If it doesn't, it's going to come up into, like you see the support here, it's going to come in a little bit lighter off of those July 31st lows and get the bounce from there. And then, of course, that bounce would potentially set these things up, right, to go back up into the higher range. And that's going to be the real test. That one will happen over the next couple of days. And as we have had for about a week and a half now, it's going to be news flow as well. Ukrainian situation continues to, progress along here. You've got Ukraine, the government forces fighting what is called the rebels in the east. Russia evidently is going to come in and do some sort of an aid. Of course, the worry there is they're going to bring military in as well. If they do, this thing's really going to heat up and this market's going to get hit. That's the real risk that's out there. It's not the economics, it's not, the earnings or anything else. It's the risk of the geopolitical escalating even farther. That's what this market's worried about. And if that news flow turns negative, and I suspect what's going to happen is you're going to get some sort of negativity in the news flow that's going to bring you down to these lower levels to get that pullback, right? And then if it's not serious and not something that's escalating even more, then the bounce again, and we'll see what that bounce does. All right, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Have yourself a great night. I'll see you next time. I'm LA. This is and was your daily TA wrap. Catch me here live every night, 4 times a week, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, or archived on YouTube. Have a great night. I'll see you next time.